Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana. Let me say it once again. Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana. That's the town that knew me when. Now if you'd like to have a logical explanation how I happened on this elegant syncopation, I will say without a moment of hesitation, there is just one place that can light my face. Gary, Indiana, Gary, Indiana, not Louisiana, Paris, France, New York.
Gary was founded in 1906 as an industrial city for the U.S. Steel Corporation. The city gets its name from Albert H. Gary, a rich businessman and founder of U.S. Steel. The Steel Age forged a city out of sandhills and swampland which formerly drew Chicago's elite for hunting. The land was on the edge of a lake and was mostly sand, but Gary and his associates thought this place to be the perfect spot for the proposed steel mill. The city rapidly grew in its first 3 years. Word spread around the world about a new place for jobs. People from countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary all immigrated to the new land for the promise of work. When many landed on U.S. soil, the only 2 words of English they knew were Indiana and Gary. That's all they needed to know to get there. The new steel workers of Gary brought their families and their dreams, and in no time the city began to grow out of necessity. The entire community lived for the thriving steel mills that employed it. The population skyrocketed from 2,000 in 1907 to 16,800 in 1910. The city's 1920 census showed that the population tripled to more than 55,000. By possessing an industry which was a lucrative money-making venture, Gary drew large numbers of different social and economic classes. The city's downtown was the home of some of the most beautiful architecture in the Midwest for its time. There was the City Hall and the City Court Building, the Memorial Auditorium, and other buildings along Broadway like the Gary Bank Building and the Hotel Gary. One of the city's most marvelous structures was the City Methodist Church. Amid a greedy, grasping throng of the steel industry, the workers needed a proper place to worship. Gary's City Methodist Church, the heart of the rushing, bustling city, was built in 1925, radiating from the heart of the city, its life and influence. Its purpose was to hold out its quiet arms to the weary and oppressed. The steel corporations kept other industries out. It didn't want other companies stealing its workers or influencing the wage rate in the city. Because of this, Gary remained a one-industry town. Just as planned, Gary became the steel capital of America. The advent of World War I slowed down the number of foreign immigrants coming into America. The great flood of immigrants coming into Gary was over. But in 1920, Gary was still very much a city of foreigners. Over 60% of residents were either foreign-born or children of immigrants. Gary was home to over 15 different nationalities. In spite of, or perhaps because of, this diversity, the school system tried to mold these children of immigrants into Americans to teach them the American way. The blacks had been in Gary from its beginnings. Those who helped build the mill, and a small few who stayed to work in the mill. In the early years of Gary, the black population was just 400, compared to more than 12,000 from Europe. But by the 1930s, Gary had the fastest growing black population in America, lured by the prospect of good jobs in the mills. Large numbers of the blacks trafficked into the city from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and other predominantly black states. When the 1930s began, nearly 18% of the city was black. At that time, Gary was not different from a typical community in the Deep South. For immigrants, the Americanization process involved the development of hostility towards the blacks. Racial separation was the American way. The power elite in Gary felt the best way to handle the problem was zoning. Gary's South Side was for people who were poor, different, people who were foreigners, or black. These poor people made up the majority, but the city was controlled by the native white-born Americans living on the North Side. In those times, segregated zoning was a fact of life. This type of racial separation was in education, housing, employment, public services, and recreation. And it was established and carried out by the city's white elite. Businessmen, bankers, realtors, educators, steel company officials, and local government leaders. These leaders felt that it was in the blacks' best interest to keep the blacks separated from whites. That way, they would receive the best treatment and education from their own kind, rather than mixing and confusing a thriving community. School Superintendent William Wirt: "We believe that it is only injustice to the Negro children that they be segregated. There is naturally a feeling between the Negroes and the whites in the lower grades, and we are sure the colored children will be better cared for in schools of their own, and they will take pride in their work and will consequently get better grades." Backing up, the strike of 1919 is what actually started the barrage of the blacks on Gary. Because of unfair labor laws, the majority of the steelworkers went on strike. The battle over union recognition was really what the strike was about, but when the whites went on strike, the blacks went to work in the mills by the truckloads. This ultimately ruined the race relations in the city. Gary's black population increased even more due to the strike and the recruiting practices of the mills. But eventually, the strike ended and the country went to war. This brought a heavy increase in steel production and continued the prosperity of the one industry town.